London, 1348. The city is not a place of knights and chivalry. It is a cesspool waiting for a spark. Imagine walking through streets where the mud is mixed with offal, where the air is thick with the scent of unwashed bodies and roasting meat. In this suffocating atmosphere, women were expected to be the fairer sex, symbols of purity and beauty. But how do you stay clean when the water is poison? How do you dye your hair and scrub your skin when the very air you breathe is believed to carry death? The reality of medieval London was a grotesque masquerade. Women painted their faces with lead and vinegar to look white as lilies, hiding the rot of their teeth and the scars of smallpox beneath layers of toxic paste. They were trying to maintain a fiction of order in a world that was about to descend into absolute chaos. The church preached that the body was a vessel of sin, yet society demanded that women present themselves as flawless ornaments. This contradiction created a psychological prison. You had to look perfect, but you were forbidden from being vain. You had to be clean, but bathing was considered a gateway to lasciviousness and disease. It was a tightrope walk over a pit of filth. And then the ships arrived from the east, carrying a cargo that would make all these petty vanities irrelevant. But before the horror truly began, the city was asleep, wrapped in its own ignorance. They worried about the taboos of fashion and the sins of the flesh, unaware that a microscopic killer was already breeding in the straw of their beds. The fleas were waiting, and they did not care if you were a peasant or a princess. The plague didn't knock, it kicked the door down. When the Black Death hit London, the fiction of civilization collapsed. The flea mentioned in the records wasn't just a nuisance, it was the executioner, Yersinia pestis. It traveled on rats, but it fed on humans. Suddenly, the women who had spent their lives worrying about social standing and the whiteness of their linen found themselves locking their doors against their own neighbors. The rows of houses in London became rows of tombs. The silence was broken only by the sound of the death cart and the scream of the infected. In this new hell, the definition of clean changed. It was no longer about hygiene, it was about spiritual purity. The church declared that the plague was God's punishment for the sins of the people, specifically the vanity of women. Preachers thundered from the pulpits that the elaborate headdresses and tight-laced gowns had invited the wrath of the Almighty. Women were scapegoated. Their beauty rituals were branded as the cause of the rot consuming the city. Imagine the terror of being told that your desire to look presentable was the reason your children were dying. This guilt was a heavy burden, heavier than the corpses piling up in the streets. Women tried to bargain with God. They traded their silks for sackcloth. They scrubbed their faces clean of the lead paint, revealing the raw, terrified skin underneath. But the plague was not a moral judge. It was a biological machine. Let's talk about the hospitals of the time. They were not places of healing. They were antechambers to the grave. When a woman fell sick, the transformation was horrific. The dye she used to color her clothes or hair became mockery as her skin turned black with gangrene. The buboes, swollen, agony-filled lymph nodes erupted in the groin and armpits, oozing pus and blood. The smell was unbearable. It was the scent of a body decomposing while the soul was still trapped inside. For the women who acted as caretakers, the wives, the mothers, the nuns, the nightmare was twofold. They were expected to nurse the dying, to wipe the brow of the infected, knowing that every touch was a potential death sentence. They were the silent heroes of the plague, standing in the center of the infection while the wealthy men fled to the countryside. They boiled water, burned aromatic herbs like rosemary and sage to ward off the miasma, and prayed over bodies that no longer looked human. But there was no cure. The metadata of history, the parish records show the truth. Entire female lines were wiped out. Grandmothers, mothers, and daughters, all taken in a single week. The domestic sphere, the woman's domain, became a slaughterhouse. Amidst this death, a strange phenomenon occurred. The taboo of the dead body was broken. In normal times, a woman's body was private, covered, and sacred. But during the plague, dignity was a luxury no one could afford. Bodies were stripped and tossed into mass graves, limbs entangled, modesty forgotten. The rows of the dead in the pits of London were a gruesome equalizer. The silk of the noblewoman rotted alongside the wool of the peasant. And for the survivors, a different kind of madness took hold. As the population plummeted, the value of labor skyrocketed. Paradoxically, after the plague, some women found a new, dark freedom. With so many men dead, widows took over businesses. They ran the breweries, they managed the estates. The officer, or the guild master, could no longer exclude them because there was no one else left to do the work. The plague had shattered the glass ceiling with a hammer of bone, but this new power came with a price. The surviving men were angry. They saw these independent women as unnatural, as usurpers profiting from the wrath of God. The backlash was fierce, leading to new laws trying to force women back into submission. Let us return to the image of Johanna, the every woman of this era. She survives the fever. She wakes up in a silent house. Her husband is dead. Her children are dead. She stands in front of a mirror, looking at a face she barely recognizes. She is alive, but she is haunted. What does she do? She goes back to the dye. She goes back to the paint, not out of vanity, but out of defiance. She dresses in her best clothes, perhaps the clothes of a dead mistress or a neighbor, and she walks out into the empty streets of London. This wasn't just fashion. It was a psychological shield. By reclaiming her appearance, she was reclaiming her humanity from the rats. She was telling death that it had missed one. This thick rose crochet game of social climbing wasn't frivolous. It was a survival instinct. But the city she walked through was changed forever. The flea had rewritten the social contract. The fear of the stranger, the fear of the touch, had become ingrained in the London psyche. The aftermath brought a wave of hedonism. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. The taboo slot of morality was ripped open. Women and men engaged in wild dances, in illicit affairs, in a desperate grab for pleasure before the darkness returned. It was a dance macabre in real life. The church looked on in horror as the people they had terrified with hellfire suddenly stopped caring. If the pious died just as fast as the sinners, why follow the rules? Women were at the forefront of this shift. They began to wear more daring clothes, lower necklines, tighter bodices. It was a reaction to the shroud. If the body is destined to rot, why not show it off while it is still warm? This shift in fashion wasn't just a trend. It was a collective trauma response. It was a scream against the void. However, this rebellion was short-lived. The authorities clamped down. New sumptuary laws were passed, dictating exactly what a woman could wear based on her income. They tried to measure the fabric of a woman's dress to the inch, trying to reimpose order on a world that had seen the end of days. History often glosses over the smell, the fear, and the grit. We see the Christian nice comic version of the Middle Ages, clean tunics, and pious prayers. But the truth is in the dirt. It is in the teeth, found in the plague pits, grinded down by stress and malnutrition. It is in the drag of the death cart on the cobblestones. The women of medieval London didn't live in a fairy tale. They lived in a survival horror. They navigated a world where a flea bite meant the end of your bloodline. They dealt with family problems that involved burying their own children in the backyard because the churchyards were full. And yet, they persisted. They kept the city running. They brewed the ale, they baked the bread, and they birthed the next generation into a world that had tried its best to kill them. So, when you think of the Middle Ages, don't think of the knights in shining armor. Think of the woman standing in a London doorway, smelling the smoke of burning bodies, clutching a pomander of herbs to her nose. She is the true survivor. She faced the invisible enemy and the judgment of her society, and she endured. Her story isn't fiction. It is the brutal, bloody foundation of our modern world. The plague didn't just kill people. It killed the old world, and women were the ones who had to sweep up the ashes and build the new one. Their silence in the history books is not an absence of strength. It is the silence of the grave, waiting for us to listen. If you want to uncover more dark truths buried by history, hit that subscribe button. The past is darker than you think.